Welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast, where we aim to educate and inspire you about how technology is changing and shaping our profession. The truth is, there's never been a more exciting time to be in procurement, but only if you're one of those organizations that's embracing the change and driving new developments. And this podcast is all about giving you the tools to help you get there. So buckle up and let's get right into this week's show. Yes, hello and welcome to the Procurement Software Podcast in what is our last episode of 2024. And this one actually is going out on Christmas Day. So if you are listening to us while you're eating your turkey or maybe stuffing yourselves with chocolates, then I hope you all have a wonderful and relaxing Christmas and time off, if indeed you celebrate it wherever you are in the world. Got a lot to pack in today, so I'm going to dive straight in because this episode is going to be a bit of a roundup of what's gone on in the procurement technology space this year and looking towards my 2025 predictions. So it's what I call the State of Procuretech address, which is a bit of a parody of what the State of the Nation addresses do when the US president addresses the nation. I'm not sure exactly when he does that, but I think it's once or twice a year. Maybe one of the Americans that's listening can correct me. So, as I mentioned, a lot to go through. I'm going to jump in with a little bit of personal news in terms of what we're doing with the podcast and with overall the content plan that we've got going into 2025. And then I'll move straight into the more meaty stuff. So one of the things that I'm really bullish on generally is newsletters and sort of gated communities or membership communities, i.e., anything that's not in the public domain on social media. And I'm probably a little bit behind the curve on this, if I'm completely honest with you. But one of the big announcements that I wanted to make is that I'm going to be moving my monthly newsletter to a weekly newsletter from January onwards. So the Procurement Software newsletter is going to be a weekly publication. We're going to be switching it around a little bit. So instead of doing a big monthly newsletter, instead, I'm going to be bringing a slightly smaller weekly publication. And while some of the features will stay the same, for example, we'll keep a weekly track instead of a monthly track of any solutions that have gotten funding or that have been acquired or that have announced new modules or developments to their product. Some of the other stuff that we do monthly, we will switch around a little bit. And probably also I'll do a couple of mini audio podcasts just to anyone that subscribes to the newsletter. So kind of like a closed podcast that we'll put out in a much smaller format as part of the weekly newsletter. So why am I doing this, I hear you ask? Well, the main reason why I wanted to do this is I want to make sure that I'm bringing the most relevant content to my audience. And the problem with podcasts is that the podcast hosting platforms don't give you very good analytics on who's actually listening to your show. And by that, I don't mean email addresses or IP addresses. I know there are all sorts of privacy concerns revolving around that, but it only really gives you the demographics in terms of country and the type of device that someone's listening to the show on. And that doesn't really tell me that much about the audience that subscribes to the podcast. Specifically, what I really want to focus on more in 2025 is to try and segment those of you who listen to or read or consume my content into those of you who are procurement practitioners or maybe, freelance consultants for that matter, versus those of you who work for procurement tech companies, because they're both quite a distinct audience. And I feel that I can serve both of you if I put the audience into those very distinct buckets. I feel that I can serve you better if I can start to segment my content a little more, depending on who I'm targeting that particular message or piece of content towards. So that's one of the reasons why I want to do a weekly newsletter. The other one is, and this is kind of related to the podcast, there's only a certain amount of content that we can put out. While obviously I have clients and my own business that I run aside from what I do on the content side. And yes, we do occasional sponsored content too. But if I'm going to effectively acknowledge that there's only a certain amount of content that I can put out there, I want to make sure that we ensure that the same quality standards apply to what we put out. So with that in mind, I have a bit of an announcement about the podcast, and that is we're going to keep the podcast going into 2025, but we're going to reduce the number of episodes that we put out. And instead of me doing a podcast that we publish weekly in a series format, we're going to keep it evergreen and run the podcast year round, but we're just going to publish it monthly. So bit of a big announcement, bit of a change of tack. I hope for those of you that have been regular listeners that you will still tune in to the monthly podcast. The monthly podcasts are by and large going to be guest episodes and sort of this type of solo episode, thought leadership type of content is going to move towards the newsletter. But like I said, if you do prefer to consume the content in an audio format, I will do some form of audio content in the newsletter too. I've not quite got everything figured out yet in terms of how I want to do it. And it might take a little bit of experimenting until we get the mix right. And I will sort of survey the audience to make sure that I take your feedback into consideration as we move towards this model. So those are my announcements over with. So let's now get into what do I think my 2025 predictions will be and the general state of the procurement tech industry in general. So the first thing that I wanted to tackle is consolidation within our industry. A lot of talk out there. And indeed, if you didn't catch it, episode 35, which I put out about a month ago, was on this topic too. And it was called How Many Procuretechs Will Still Be Around in 2 years' Time? And the trigger for that episode was a LinkedIn post that I saw from John W. Hansen, who is well-respected thought leader in this space. I know John and I love what he puts out from a content perspective, but I just fundamentally disagreed with what he was saying. So he was predicting that 70% of the AI-focused procurement tech solutions won't exist in 2 years' time. Go back and have a listen to episode 35 if you want the full lowdown on why I disagree with John. But my take on this is there will be some consolidation for sure. You know, good companies go bad and bad companies go bankrupt. That's just the way of business. But I genuinely don't believe that it will be as bad as what some of the doom mongers, John included, are predicting. That in itself is probably not that helpful to you. So I wanted to focus and drill down a little bit more and say, well, I wanted to drill down a little bit more and look at how to spot a procurement tech company that may be in trouble. Because it's great knowing that there might be some consolidation coming along, but that doesn't really help you as a practitioner or maybe even as an employee in a procurement software company when it comes to spotting some of the warning signs. So first one is, have there been drastic cuts that they've made to their staff? That could be a sign that they don't have much runway left and that they need to cut the number of employees to make their VC money go as far as possible so that they can show that they're growing or making a profit by the time they come back into the market and look for funding. So that's one big warning sign that they're in trouble or they may not be seeing the growth that they thought they would be. Similarly, have they suddenly stopped exhibiting at conferences? Now, some procurement tech companies just don't go to conferences as part of their marketing strategy, and that's fine. You know, some companies will see a better ROI on conferences than others. That's the way of the world. But specifically, if a company was seemingly throwing money around like confetti in terms of the events and conferences that they were sponsoring, until very recently. And then suddenly you don't see them anymore. That's kind of telling you something. And then the third one is, and this is kind of related to whether they've made some pretty big cuts to their payroll. Has a procurement tech company that used to be very prolific on LinkedIn, or that used to be very prolific with the amount of webinars or white papers or podcasts that they put out, have they suddenly and very abruptly stopped putting out regular content? If they have, then that's probably a sign that they fired their marketing team and they just don't have the resources anymore to put into content, which again can be a warning sign that they're not seeing the level of growth that they originally had planned for. If we look at this on the flip side, conversely, are they hiring for a bunch of roles without you being able to see much evidence of their maturity as a company? So if they're seemingly hiring left, right, and center, but for example, there are no customer case studies on their website and there's not much substance behind their product, it's not that easy to get a demo with them, which is, again, is another sign that perhaps it's not a very mature product. That's on the other side, a company that's maybe got some funding and is just trying to scale too quickly. So just a few things there to look out for in terms of potential consolidation that might be coming. So moving swiftly on, which areas of procurement tech do I think will flourish and am I particularly bullish about? And this one again is kind of tied into a recent episode that I put out, episode 33, which was a couple of months ago. I think it was end of October. I put out an episode entitled Which Areas of Procuretech Excite Me and Which Ones Don't. So if you're interested in taking a little bit more of a long form listen to that to get my full thoughts, then head to that episode. This one is going to focus on which areas I think are going to flourish in 2025. Number one is Agentic AI or AI co-pilots. There were no AI co-pilots on the market about a year ago, or maybe there was one. If I think back, I think there was probably one that was very much focused on procurement and supply chain. Now I could name you 5. So similarly to intake a couple of years ago, this one seems to be an area that there's a lot of money going into, a lot of startups popping up onto the scene, and generally quite a lot of enthusiasm around. What do I mean by agentic AI? Because it's kind of a confusing term if you don't follow this space closely. By that, I mean something that can typically take large language or pretext and be able to then interpret what the user is saying to it and to come with process automation or a suggestion or a workflow as a result of what you're telling it to do. So think of it a little bit like an administrative assistant in procurement. The other thing that I'm really bullish on are niche category solutions and also niche industry specific solutions and solutions that are expressly focused on a particular geographical area. I think, and I'm going to quote something that was a very common phrase in the online business space going back a few years ago, and that is the riches are in the niches. And that only rhymes if you say niches in American English, because we would say niches, but you get the point. So what this means is being able to drill down on a specific topic and go narrow and deep. And I do think that there is a market for that in the procurement tech space. These are not going to be the next unicorns. They're not going to be the next Zip, but nonetheless, there are some very solid businesses out there to be built if you want to focus on being, for example, my recent guest, Praveen from Workrise, in I think it was episode 36, and they were a source to pay solution focused specifically on the energy sector or the oil and gas sector, because it is very nuanced in terms of the requirements that sector has, with a lot of complex project-based work and a lot of complex contingent workforce management requirements. Likewise, I think there are a few emerging markets out there. And the one that immediately springs to mind is Brazil, that don't really have a country-specific procurement tech landscape, but as a market, they are huge. Brazil is a country of over 200 million people. They all speak the same language, Portuguese, and it's a relatively mature emerging market. It's not a first world country, but it's also, a lot of its economy. And I've been to Sao Paulo, looks and feels like a first world country in many ways when you drive around the business district and when you take a bus. There are very developed aspects of their economy. And I just think big emerging markets like Brazil or Turkey or Indonesia, some of the bigger ones that are, solid middle income economies, there's a procurement tech ecosystem to be built just to serve those markets. So that's the second one. What about intake and process orchestration? Well, I think in 2025, and I still remain, by the way, very bullish on this as a category and as a subcategory of procurement tech. I still remain bullish on this in general, but I do think we may start to see the limits of how much growth is possible here, which might lead to the shakeout perhaps of one or two that are playing around the edges. So Zip, obviously, as the market leader, they're in the driving seat when it comes to the amount of funding that they've raised. But the example that I would raise there is, can Zip make that crossover? Can they cross the chasm from where they've been very, very successful in high growth technology companies that don't have a mature procurement organization? They don't have a lot of legacy technology. They don't have ingrained departments like in-house legal and internal audit that will always come up with 10 reasons why you can't do something that you want to do. Will companies like Zip be able to make the crossover into more traditional old economy businesses that do have that legacy tech infrastructure and that do have a lot of these more compliance and technocracy focused roles embedded into their organizational structure? That's where I think that we might start to see some limitations around how much growth this as a sector is able to drive. Okay, what else? Well, maybe a little bit controversial, but B2B marketplaces. I just don't see the point in them, especially those which are very, very country focused. Now, there are players out there that are doing some great stuff in the marketplaces space. Axiom is the one that immediately springs to mind. Had a great meeting with Alistair, one of their co-founders, on the edges of DPW when I was in Amsterdam this year. But the ones that are just straightforward B2B marketplaces that are focused especially on a specific country, I just think that supplier discovery tools, something like a Matchery or a Scoutbee or an Alpus, these are going to make marketplaces irrelevant as the price of these tools drops and more organizations adopt them. Even if you get supplier discovery tools that can be offered on an as a service type of basis where you pay per search rather than having an annual subscription, I think it's just going to put marketplaces out of business and they will become increasingly irrelevant. So if you're a VC out there and you're thinking of investing in a B2B marketplace, I would maybe have second thoughts. Talk to me if you're curious about this. I also think there's probably going to be some consolidation in what I would describe as the middle of the road source to pay, source to contract landscape. So some of the older, more legacy tools that are not, the market leaders. So I certainly don't see Coupa, iValua, SAP Ariba, even Jagger and Zycus really going anywhere, or GEP for that matter. But some of the ones that are more mid-range, middle of the road, not particularly innovative, don't have the marketing budget and the resources that the top 5 of them do, they're going to struggle to acquire new customers. And especially they're going to struggle to replace those who churn. So I wouldn't be surprised to see some sort of consolidation in that area of the marketplace as well. Another one where I'm a little bit bearish is contract lifecycle management tools. And I know Dr. Eloise Eberstein shares this opinion too. It was interesting to hear her recent thoughts on this one. So my general thoughts on the contract management space are that I think contract lifecycle management that focuses on post-contract signature will increasingly get absorbed into supplier relationship management or vendor lifecycle management tools. I know there's a bit of a crossover there in terminology. So I think the post-contract management will kind of get consolidated into SRM. So they will kind of merge in terms of what those solutions offer. And anything that's focused on pre-contract management, workflow, and things like clause libraries, in authoring and markup, AI-driven redlining and suggested changes to contracts, clause extraction tools, all of that, I think, will focus more and more towards legal as their target customer rather than procurement. So I still think there'll be a market for these types of tools, but I think they will increasingly focus on legal as their customer rather than procurement. Okay, so that's which areas of procurement am I bullish on, which ones am I a little bit more bearish on. Moving swiftly on, let's talk now about the great AI debate, because I know everyone's talking about AI. What are my thoughts on AI? So I'm going to take two different standpoints here. So the first one was put out by my good friend, Daniel Barnes, and I love Dan and the content that he puts out. I think he's a really impressive thought leader. He was saying that 80% of procurement roles will be replaced by AI. That's an article that he put out on his recent Substack newsletter. And while I think Dan was probably being a bit provocative there, I don't think it will be 80%. And then the counter argument was coming from the Procurement Says No podcast. And Ed and Rich, the co-hosts of this show, were basically debunking Daniel and saying this is rubbish and procurement will be quite low down the list of priorities when it comes to investment in AI tools. And their rationale for that was that procurement is not seen as strategic in most organizations, and that the investment will go into sales or will go into HR before it goes into procurement. So where do I sit on this? Well, I sit somewhere in the middle, but I'm probably leaning more towards Dan's position. So I think AI is going to replace a lot of roles in procurement. And I also think that to a large extent, procurement is a little bit asleep at the wheel when it comes to this. I certainly don't think it's going to be 80%. And I certainly don't think it will happen as quickly as Dan is suggesting in his article that he thinks it will come. But the fundamentals are this. Procurement is still seen by most organizations as being an overhead, as being a cost center. Spoken about this a lot on LinkedIn and on the podcast, but businesses still often don't see or don't appreciate our true value. And yes, that is sometimes down to us being not very good at internal communication. But I think this is a ripe case to make that AI is going to come in and reduce the number of FTEs that are needed to staff a procurement team. Because if the organization doesn't see procurement as being strategic and they want to reduce headcount somewhere, this is a great way to do it, right? So if I take the most extreme scenario, and I'm not necessarily saying that I believe this will happen, but I certainly think it's possible. And that is that some of the more strategic aspects of procurement that will most definitely be kept within a corporate structure may ultimately end up reporting into supply chain or the COO if we're talking about direct spend. You know, things like pricing, predictive price analytics and predictive spend analytics and supply chain resilience and ESG and carbon reduction. That could end up reporting into supply chain or the COO in the most extreme circumstances. And then if we look at indirects, well, everything that's seen as being valuable in the indirect space could then report into the specific stakeholders that affects. So finance, for example, for compliance, IT for the increasing significance of IT spend and IT procurement strategy, and then marketing, obviously, for any for any support and any strategic input that procurement can give in the whole sales and marketing space. I don't necessarily think this will happen, but I certainly think it's possible. And I think most of the nonchalance when it comes to the impact that AI is going to have in procurement is predominantly down to leadership not particularly well understanding what AI can do. And, we know that there are a lot of procurement leaders out there that are not particularly tech savvy and are quite technocratic in their approach. And yes, this is changing. We're getting more millennials coming into procurement leadership positions, and they are, typically speaking, more tech savvy. But a lot of leaders out there think that AI is just being able to use ChatGPT to do a little bit of research. And honestly, using ChatGPT to do research isn't really the best use case for generative AI or large language models. And I was perhaps a little bit in the dark about this too up until recently. And a good friend of mine who's a bit of a marketing whiz, having lunch with her one day, and she was talking about custom GPTs and what they can do. And she was basically saying that she's got a bunch of custom GPT AI assistants that she'd built within OpenAI's ChatGPT that basically run all of her marketing for her. And I was kind of blown away by that. And she showed me under the hood a little bit and did a bit of a presentation in a local marketing group that I attend. And I went away from that thinking, I need to upskill a little bit and learn more about what this can do. Anyway, fast forward a few months, and I'm fully convinced now that AI is going to be able to take away a lot more workload than we probably give it credit for. And one example that I'm going to give and that I actively use this for, and yes, you've got to be careful when it comes to privacy here in that you're not giving it anything confidential to ingest, but document analysis and interpretation is an excellent use case for AI. For example, I upload a podcast episode. So I get my podcast recording platform. I get an AI generated transcription from my podcast recording platform that I use. That AI transcription is usually pretty garbage because it's got all of my ums and ers and false starts, and it's got a lot of words that are misspelled. So it's not really coherent to take that text. But if I upload that text file into ChatGPT, and if I give ChatGPT the right prompt, it can write a very, very coherent and eloquent summary in about 1,000 words of every single podcast episode that I've recorded. So if you take that use case and then think, well, it could do the same and it could ingest quite complex white papers and analysis and help us to simplify and digest that when it comes to formulating category strategies, for example, or RFP preparation, for example. It's going to eliminate a lot of work that category managers traditionally would have done. Likewise with RFP preparation, and likewise with the example that I was talking about a few minutes ago around Agentic AI, it's going to replace the need for email traffic between procurement and our stakeholders and our suppliers. If you've got an AI agent that can ask simple questions, when is my invoice due for payment? Is my delivery of widgets still going to be delivered this Wednesday? Is my consignment still stuck in customs? That type of simple question will no longer need to be handled by a procurement agent or by an operational buyer. AI is going to completely replace that. So anyway, that's my thoughts on AI. What's next? Funding. So let's talk about funding. Despite the doom and gloom around funding, there's still plenty of VC money sloshing around. And for those of you who read the monthly newsletter, you'll have seen, I think it was October, the summer was fairly quiet, but in October, I think there were 7 or 8 funding announcements, and a couple of them were pretty juicy announcements as well, talking tens of millions of dollars. So there's still plenty of money out there. So, if we take the doom and gloom, especially in Europe around the economy, and yes, VCs are asking a lot more questions now. They're not throwing money around like they were in 2020 and 2021, but pre-seed and seed funding is still pretty easy to get, what I'm hearing, as long as you have paying customers that aren't just your ex-boss or your former employer. So as long as you've got some paying customers, and as long as you've got a credible growth plan and a sales and marketing strategy that's starting to show some fruition, and that your initial customers aren't just based on your little red book of connections, there's still VC money out there. What I would say is that Series A and beyond is definitely harder than it was. So I'm still pretty optimistic on funding. There will be some, as I mentioned earlier, there will be some solution providers that don't make it. But if you're out there building a prototype and you're thinking, oh no, it might be difficult to get funding, as long as you've got some good advice behind you, and as long as you've got a founding team of pretty experienced A players when it comes to sales and marketing to get some customers through the door, then I think you'll be okay. So then finally, my last one in terms of procurement tech predictions or state of the market as we go into 2025 is the good old build versus buy debate that just keeps coming back like a boomerang. So what are my thoughts on build versus buy? If you're thinking of building a software, think about it this way. Your IT department and an outsourced team of development engineers and product engineers are not going to be able to beat the hundreds of millions of venture capital dollars that have gone into building, growing, perfecting, and maturing procurement technology companies. If you as an organization are that arrogant to think that you can beat them, you're living in cloud cuckoo land, I'm afraid. Now, yes, there are sometimes cases to build your own software. If your IT department is super conservative, or if you're maybe in something like the defense industry and because of security concerns, you absolutely have to have on-prem or self-built solutions for whatever reason, and there's no way that your IT security team is ever going to change their minds on this, then okay, build your own software. Likewise, if you want to build prototypes just for speed or to get proof of concept, if you want to build something internally so as you don't have to jump through the hoops of involving IT to go through cybersecurity audits and all that stuff that big corporates often have, then yes, building something internally, especially using no-code or low-code applications, can get you to the point where you have a pilot or a proof of concept a lot faster than if you're considering buying it. So in that case, I kind of understand why you might want to build. And it has definitely some advantages if you're able to get proof of concept that can then convince your CFO or your IT team to go out and look at some specialist cloud-based software that can go to the next level. So in that case, I can see the advantage. But for everything else, please don't try and build your own software, for the love of God. If you have a center of excellence team, even if you're a pretty big corporate procurement team that's got center of excellence, stick to what you're good at. Designing and building software isn't one of your strong points. So don't try unless you absolutely have to. If you choose the buy route, you're going to get better UI UX. You're going to have the product roadmap from the software company that you can influence if you're a pretty big customer. You're going to have bug-free software because they're going to have tens of customers that are already using it, that have ironed out a lot of the hiccups along the way. You're going to have a huge variety of solutions to choose from. We've got over 440 solutions in our procurement software database. If you've not checked it out yet, go to procurementsoftware.site to have a look at how you can search and filter for procurement software solutions, all completely free of charge. There are increasingly much closer partnerships between different best of breed procurement software providers. So if you're thinking that you want to make your own solution because you don't fancy any of the big legacy source to pay suites on the market, that is not your only choice anymore. look at some of the best of breed tools and go with maybe 2 or 3 of those, have partnerships with each other that make that tech integration much easier to have that joined up procurement tech solution that gives you what you need. And then if you do, for whatever reason, decide to go down the all-in-one suite option, just bear in mind that some of these, and I'm thinking Cooper and Ariba specifically, now have app stores or marketplaces as part of their ecosystem. So you can still bolt on point solutions or best of breed solutions if you find, which you inevitably will, that the suite that you've decided to go with doesn't do function X or function Y particularly well. You've still got that option to be able to bolt on best of breed solutions onto that suite. So looking at this more holistically, unless you are absolutely forced because of your internal IT policy to go down the make route or the build route, the only reason I would build is for speed or to get a pilot or a proof of concept out there. So that rounds up my 2025 predictions / state of Procuretech address in this very last week of 2024. A little bit longer than my usual solo episodes, but like I said, a lot to cover in this one. So what do you think? Do you broadly agree? Or to use a very British term, do you think I'm talking bollocks? Drop me an email, james@procurementsoftware.site. I'd love to hear from you, or just send me a DM on LinkedIn. And if we're not connected there already, please reach out and I would love to connect and have you as part of my network. Always love to hear from anyone that listens to the show. And as I said, wishing you a wonderful rest of your Christmas holiday and a healthy and prosperous and successful start to your 2025. I appreciate every single one of you that has downloaded the podcast and supported us during 2024 and beyond. And I look forward to having you tune in and indeed subscribing to the newsletter. Link is in the show notes in 2025. All the best, take care, and bye for now.